Hi guys! Today I'm going to be painting this watercolor robin. Now I did my sketch ahead of time just because it does tend to take a little bit of time to do the sketch and I didn't want to make this video too long. You can see I wet down my watercolor palette with a spray bottle and now I'm jumping in to wet down my background here with a large rounded flat brush. Any large brush would work, it's just the one I had handy. Now I'm going to be applying water everywhere that isn't the robin or the foreground twig. So just all over the page here. Now I'm painting on a rather large surface and it's very dry in my house, so chances are this will not stay wet. So now I'm going in with a more detailed brush. This is a number 10 round. And I'm going around the robin just to make sure that I go right against the pencil line. Time to start adding color. Now you can look at my palette and see how muddy it is, and I actually really enjoy pulling from that center part, especially when I'm trying to paint realistically. But I'm pulling in some blue, some Payne's gray, and then whatever was on the palette beforehand, so probably a little bit of a brownish color. And I'm just putting down a really cool gray on the background. And you can see my paint, my background's already dry. My paint has a hard edge to it, at least on the top it does. So once I'm done with this color, I'm just going to add in a little bit of water along the edge there to create a soft edge. So one way to do a wet on wet background is to wet your whole background down first. Another way to do wet on wet is to blend your wet colors together. So if your color is dry when you put it down, just work fast, make sure that you put a wet color beside it, and the two colors will blend together as long as they're both wet. So again, trying to work quickly here. My background is drying fast. I'm just adding a little bit of Payne's gray to my green, a little bit of blue there. And I'm creating a nice dark green to go behind the robin. This is going to help frame the robin by having the dark green there. It's going to pull my eye in. Everything else is going to be kind of light in color, kind of muted. So having that dark green there will help to pull my eye to the center of the page and help to frame the bird. Now I have a reflection that I'm painting at the base here. So the green I put above that kind of white gap is going to be the green that is in the atmosphere, and then the green that is below it is going to be in the reflection. So as we go here, what we do to the top of the painting, we need to also kind of do that to the bottom of the painting. So I'm going to be going up and down as I go there. So I just pulled a little bit of paint out. That was the divide between the atmosphere and the reflection. Now I've sped up my painting quite a bit here because this wet on wet background is a little bit time consuming, and I just didn't want the video to be an hour and a half long. So I've sped up a lot of this painting just to help with that. Help make it a more manageable video to watch for you guys. If you're painting along, I recommend pausing as you go, especially in these areas where I go a little bit fast. So what I recommend you do is kind of watch me, pause, paint, unpause, watch me, pause, paint. That's how I would approach a tutorial like this. Still just kind of throwing in these colors, the wet on wet, doing what I do to the top to the bottom, trying to make that reflection feel natural. You can see my colors are pulling together because they're all wet, touching each other. Now I'm going into my robin reflection here because I want to do this while there's still a little bit of coldness, like a little bit of a damp paper at the bottom. And I don't want to touch the robin yet because when I'm doing my robin, I want to make sure that all the background is very dry. So I'm going to kind of be hopping around here a little bit. Now I'm going to do the reflection part of the orange now. I'm mixing a little bit of a cool red in with a very, very warm, aggressive orange. I actually think that this is a cadmium red if I'm not mistaken, but it looks orange to me, so I call it orange. And then I'm doing a little bit of a warm yellow as well in there, and I'm going to let those colors marry because they're wet on wet down there. Getting a little bit of overlap into the brown, which I'm not loving, just going to lift that up with the paper towel. I clench a paper towel in my hand as I'm painting, just in case I need to quickly pick up some color. Or clean a brush. Just dabbing that color in. I want this to feel very loose. Now I forgot this little bit of background here, so I'm just doing a quick little wet on wet here for the background between the tail and the branch. Now I really wanted that background to be a little bit darker, and I wanted the outline between the background and the bird to be a little bit more aggressive. So I'm just going back in. My background is dry, so I'm going to have to add some water here along the edge to soften that green. So that's what I did there, is I just added some clean water. And I'm going to be adding a little bit of water to that space in general, just to kind of help those colors bleed together. And I'm going to eventually add a little bit more green in here to make that just a little bit more aggressive even. There we go. And I want that to be balanced. So you see on the other side where we have that darker blue in the background, I'm also going to do it there as well. Adding just a little hint of warmth there. There's some kind of a yellow thing in my reference, and I like it, so I'm just throwing it in. Again, doing what I did to the top, I'm adding that into the bottom as well, that reflection on the bottom. Now there's that blue on the other side. So I'm speeding this up because it's basically the same process. The paint is dry, so I have to soften the edge with a clean damp brush. And you can see how I put down my aggressive blue and then I just kind of softened around it to help it fade into the background. And I'm going to throw that same blue color down into our reflection. When I do my reflection, I do long strokes that are horizontal on the page. That one got a little bit too dark there, so I'm going to have to pick it up a bit. But I kind of do long strokes from edge to edge almost, or zigzags going from back and forth, really narrow zigzags. And that gives me the illusion of a reflection. And it also allows me to preserve some areas for highlights. So you can see I have basically like a pretty full wash at the bottom, but I am going to be darkening it so as we go, just in those zigzag patterns. And that'll help to pull out some negative space too. And I'll keep reworking that too. I'll do a zigzag that's dark, and then I'll go into it with a little bit of a darker color, and then even darker still after that dries, just to build up some shadow and some darker areas, and that'll help those highlights pop. Contrast is key. Contrast is tough with watercolor too, because your instinct is to add water, and that tends to, really mute your colors. But where you have darks, just add less water and just make sure that you go over them a few times if you need to, gently, of course, so you don't wreck your paper. Now I'm going to go in and just start to add a little bit of branch detail here. I'm still using a pretty thick paintbrush. I think this is still my number 10 round, but I'm just using the very tip, and that's giving me some control. If you have a good tip on a round brush, you can almost do everything with it. But I am going to end up switching here to a slightly smaller brush pretty quick, because I am finding it a little bit hard to get the detail work with my number 10 round brush. The brushes I use in this painting, with the exception of the flat brush we used for the background water when we did the wet on wet wash, is a number 10 round, and then this is a number 6 round brush. And then I also use a number 4 round and a 0 round, and those are the only brushes that I use. Sometimes I'll do a whole painting with a number 10 and a 0, but with this particular one, there's a couple of like this brush is great because it holds a lot of paint. This is the number 6 round, but you can still get some thick brush strokes or thin brush strokes. I'm just going back in here with some darker colors. Now, a lot of people would not jump in this dark this fast for the branch, but I like to. And the reason for that is that for me, the hardest part of watercolor is preserving that white paper. When you have a highlight, it's the absence of paint that gives you that highlight, right? And I just really struggle with that. So what I'll do if I'm doing a detail area with a lot of texture like these branches is I'll go straight in with some dark paint, and I'll just really emphasize the shadows, and then I'll build out from there. Rather than trying to imagine where my highlights are, I just kind of start to build shadow into highlight. And that's kind of the opposite thing of what you want to do with watercolor. Usually you start light and you work your way dark, but for something like this, I tend to start dark and then work back into light. And because I'm starting dark, I just have to be really careful not to do a wash over top of this, because if I do, what I'll do is I'll end up pulling that paint into other parts of the painting, and I don't want that. And my background is basically done at this point, so I don't need to worry about that too much. But when I go back over top of the branches and the twigs, I just don't want to have too much water on my brush when I'm adding the other colors so that I don't get a bleed off of that dark area. Now I'm hopping into the bird. Everything around my bird is dry now, which is great, so I can go ahead and start to add in my bird colors. Now the first thing we do is we just again establish our base colors. So I'm adding in some deeper orange mixed with a little bit of red and a little bit of brown to the left hand side, and then when I get over to the right hand side, I'm going to add in some really warm yellow, and I'm going to let those two colors kind of meet in the middle to create that sort of dynamic look that we're trying to achieve, where it's darker on one side and a little bit lighter on the other side, also a little bit cooler on one side and a little bit warmer on the other side. So by pulling in that really cool red into the left hand side, we've created a little bit of a cool texture, color. And then the yellow on the right hand side creates a little bit more warmth. Now I'm doing this, I'm kind of zigzagging and stippling, and I'm not going in with big brush strokes here. And the reason for that is that I want to kind of start but with a base texture. So you see I'm doing a lot of stippling, trying to build up some texture in this space here. I'm lifting some paint there with some stippling as well. I had a little bit too much there. There, so you can already see some texture in there. It feels soft. Now this is my favorite part, is painting in the white area. So I'm going in with yellow ochre right now, mixed with just a little bit of brown, and I'm giving a little bit of warmth to the belly of the bird, which is white, but of course it's not really white, right? If you look at white, even if you look at clouds, there's always a little bit of color in there. And with this particular bird, I think the feathers are tinted just a little bit yellow here. And then I'm adding in some blue as well, just to kind of, for contrast. The warm and the cool together is really beautiful. My two favorite colors to paint with are Payne's Gray and Yellow Ochre. And I'm kind of doing that here. My blue has a little bit of Payne's Gray in it, and my brown color is mostly Yellow Ochre. So you can see how nice those two colors kind of blend together, right? They just really, really work well with each other there. I've got a little too dark there, so I'm just going to clean my brush, again, pull it out there. So I'm working my colors together while everything is still wet. You can see I've kind of avoided touching the orange because I didn't want the orange to bleed into the white part of the belly. Just small little brush strokes, little tiny amounts of paint because I really want my paint to be muted. Now here I'm going in with more aggressive paint because this is a shadow area. There's a shadow being cast from the wing and also onto the tail there. So I'm just using, this is Payne's Gray, but you can see that the Payne's Gray bled into the belly because it was wet there. So I got a nice soft shadow, and I'm going to build that shadow out in layers as I go. Now I'm jumping into the wings, just establishing kind of a base tone again. So this is our base layer, starting off with a bit of Payne's Gray, pulling in some browns, pulling in some yellow ochre as well there. All sorts of fun stuff. And then once we establish this base layer, we're going to continue to build, wait for it to dry, build, wait for it to dry, build. Now this is my style of painting, right? So a lot of watercolor artists don't do this kind of layering method as much as I do. And the reason I think I do my paintings like this is because I was drawing long before I was painting. And when I draw, I really get into my details. I really love detail work, so that my drawing technique kind of comes through in my watercolor paintings as well. I really get into the details of it all. Now you can see that the paint is kind of dried, right? That brown feels very harsh, so I need to take a wet brush and kind of pull that out. So I've tried to soften it there. I've created a second hard edge though, but that's okay. We're gonna keep on kind of playing with this until we get those transitions feeling nice and soft. So we'll just be going back and forth, add a bit of water. There we go. Pull out some paint, lay down some more paint. Being sure that we do very gentle brush strokes. So I'm not pressing hard. I'm not, scratching into my page. I'm just being very gentle. Here I'm picking a little bit up with a paper towel. I went a little bit too deep with that shadow color. Softening that edge. Adding just a little bit of a warmer brown here. Now I'm trying to, there's a little bit of a glow on the bird, so I'm trying to maintain that glow. So right around the outer edge of the body of the bird there, where we have brightness. And I believe that this is a backlit bird, so there's a little bit of a light coming from the opposite side of what we're looking, how we're looking at it, and that creates a little bit of a halo effect, especially where the feathers are a little fluffier. So you're not going to see that halo effect on the wingtips or the long feathers. You're going to see it more on the soft feathers, the kind of down feathers in the body. Again, still building in our base layer here, adding a little bit of yellow ochre, softening some areas that were a little bit aggressive. Pulling the paint around on the page, just trying to manipulate it. Always thinking about the direction of the feathers when you're adding in those brush strokes. Now these two branches here are less significant than the one the bird is sitting on. They're a lot more background. So I just kind of threw in the wash on top of those, and I'll add a shadow at some point, starting to play back into the reflection. That particular branch was very important for the reflection because it kind of crossed paths with the water. It's the only thing that connects the water to the atmosphere. So I did a little bit of a light brown there on the branch. Now I'm going in with my dark brown mixed with a little bit of Payne's gray. Getting in some of those shadows, getting in some of that detail. Trying to preserve the white of the highlight as much as I can. Now the bird is casting a shadow on the branch itself, so underneath the bird you're going to see just a little bit more dark than you will on the rest of the branch. Oh, that texture on the wing got a little too aggressive, so I'm just going to pick a little bit of it up on the one side with a wet brush. Now you don't want to overwork your paper. If you're working with cheaper watercolor paper, which, you know, I totally recommend doing, especially if you're learning, because watercolor paper is so expensive. You can't do that many layers on it. So you can see that I've worked this area quite a bit. Now, if I were using a cheaper watercolor paper, a thinner watercolor paper, my paper would probably start to wreck at this stage. So if you're using watercolor paper that is a little less expensive or a little bit on the thinner side, try to avoid doing too many layers like I'm doing with a wash. You can do more detail layers, but it's when your page is saturated, that's what you want to avoid. Now I'm getting more into the detail area now, the detail part of this. It's still a little bit of wet on wet, but we're getting close to our detail phase here. So I'm adding in a shadow. There's a little bit of a, like the feathers layer on top of each other, right? So we have to add in some shadows here. So that's what I'm doing, is adding in that first layer of shadow on top of our base layer. So this is when we start to get into the detail phase just a little bit. We can still add a wash on top of detail, but you'll lose a little bit of your detail when you do that. So, and I'm okay with that at this stage because we're still, you know, we still have a long way to go on this painting, but just keep that in mind. You don't want to add in those really fine details until you have your base layer established. Now I'm using my warm brown here to bring a little bit of a warm color into the wing. You see it in the photo reference, you see some warmth in the brown. Right now our brown feels a little bit cool, even though we used yellow ochre. Yellow ochre is kind of a muted color. We've dulled it down with the Payne's gray, which is very cool. And we've been using our dark brown, which is also, you know, I would say it's neutral. It's not warm, it's not cool. So this really will help the bird pop. because our background is so cool, so we want a little bit of warmth in the feathers. So this nice warm brown will help. Adding in a bit of shadow. You can't really tell, but I'm feathering right now. So I'm taking my zero brush and I was just kind of flicking some paint out into the white so that my line wasn't straight and aggressive. So I was just trying to soften my line. That's called feathering. Not just because it's a bird, it's just a term. Adding in that shadow on the tail. It just goes right down to the tip. And now we're doing a little bit more shadow, a little bit of that warm brown coming into the wing there again. A little bit more shadows, adding in some texture. Always pulling the brush in the direction of those feathers. I love painting birds. I love that there's kind of a map for you, right? Because the texture is kind of consistent, right? It's not crisscrossy. I mean, it kind of is crisscrossy in the belly actually, but especially when you get to the wings, it's kind of, these long brush strokes feel really nice in there. This is such a round bird. It almost looks too round. I wonder if it's pregnant. I've got some eggs in there or something. Maybe it's just a really healthy, well-fed bird. Who knows? So again, I'm going back in with some detail. So I said we'd be doing lots of layers, and that's how I paint. And we're back in here again, building up these shadows, building up these textures that we've already established, just with a slightly darker color. So darkening it as we go, just bit by bit. It probably looks a little bit tedious, but it's part of the painting that I really enjoy. Just getting that texture in there. Oops, got a little too aggressive there. There we go. I want to keep the top of the bird very light, so that one brush stroke was just a little bit too dark there. So I'm using my zero. I'm putting down paint. I'm kind of cleaning my brush, and I'm going in with some water and softening it if I need to. This is part of that shadow, just pulling in. I wet down that area there, and I'm going to add in a little bit more darkness just to have a soft shadow under the wing. I want that shadow to feel a little bit more aggressive, so I'll eventually go in with yet another layer and just add some more Payne's Gray to that shadow area. And now I get to jump back into the belly, and I love this. I love pulling the texture into the white area. You use so little paint, so much water, but you don't want your brush to be too wet, so you kind of have to dab it on a paper towel just to get a little bit of that water off your brush. There we go. So that's a little bit more of a dry brush there. But I mean, it's not dry. It's the paint is very watered down. There's just not a lot of it on the paintbrush. But it gives us those really subtle little lines, and especially in an area that's white, that looks great. Now here's a little bit of crisscrossy paint strokes, so I'm not going straight up and down. I'm doing a little bit of crisscrosses there, and here I'm pulling in a little bit of orange. You can see I'm just doing it right from the painting, so you can just, if you have a little bit of moisture on your brush and you go over top of watercolor, what you do is you reactivate the paint. So I was able to pull a little bit of orange into the white just by touching the orange with a wet brush. And because I had such a buildup there, and I'm not done with the orange part yet, and I want texture anyway, I just decided to do it right from the painting. Now this is a dirty red mixed with a little bit of blue here. So I have my red, I've mixed it onto my dirty palette, and then I've added just a little bit of blue in to cool it off, and that's given me this kind of natural looking rose color. And this is going to be the base for both the feet and the beak. Now I've added in 3 toes to the front foot and then 2 to the back, and that's all you can see. You can't see the other toes in there. Now I'm going in with a more deep kind of reddish orange color here, pulling more red in. Again, you can see I'm really focusing on the direction of the feathers there. So I'm pulling away from the beak, away from the eye, kind of down into the chest. So here's a close-up of my palette. Now you can see how I'm mixing the blue in with the rose color that I blended for the feet. Now that blue is just a really dark blue color. And here I am adding in some texture. So the foot has dried, so now we can go in and add those kind of wrinkles. Now I get a little bit too carried away with this here, but it ends up looking fine in the end. Just the feet are so textured that I wanted to kind of call that out. And now I'm adding a little bit of Payne's Gray in to just establish a bit of a shadow there as well. A little shadow on the back toe. And I'm doing this now because I do want it to kind of blend in with that red color, that dirty rose color, I should say, that I just threw in there. So just building up some texture there. I'm going to do the same thing on the other foot. Want to make sure I do both feet at the same time. That way my color is consistent. Now I'm adding in the claw. So this is just a watered down Payne's Gray. And then once I get that in, I'm gonna get a really saturated Payne's Gray. So very little water, and I'll just do the shadow part of that talon there. There we go. Gives it a little bit more depth than just going in with straight Payne's Gray. Now Payne's Gray is also going to be my shadow color on the branch, so I'm adding that in as well, and it'll be the color I use for the darkest of the textures. So I'll do a little bit of that right now too. Again, this video is sped up slightly. This part here is not quite actual speed. So if it feels like I'm going fast, it's because I did speed up the video, you know, for the sake of not having a huge long video here for you to watch. Just slightly. It's not too sped up, this part. Adding in with that rose color, just a few little buds on the branch here. I try not to use too many colors in my paintings. Now, of course, my palette is so messy that I'm not too sure what I'm using, but I'm pulling from the same areas. I'm not sure if you've noticed that. So I'm using the same muddy version of one color in different areas, and trying to consistently use that as much as I can. So I'm pulling from the same spots here for the branch and also for the wings and in the reflection, and so that it doesn't get too complicated. Adding in a bit more texture to that belly. Love that. Love that texture there. Soften that up a little bit. There we go. There are still some pure white areas in the belly, especially around the outside, because we have that halo light happening from the backlight of the bird. There we go, back into the branch here, just having a soft shadow. You can see I'm still preserving a little bit of the texture there, even though I'm adding in the shadow. Now I'm going in with my Payne's Gray to get that nice dark part of the shadow. I'll pick that up just a little bit there. There we go. Got it crept into the foot there a little bit too much. All right, now for the eye. I feel like a painting always looks more complete when you add in the eye. So this is probably my favorite part of any kind of animal painting, is the eye. Especially like bird eyes, because they're not overly complicated, not like human eyes are. Usually if you have a really solid highlight and a really nice dark black of the eye, then they look, you know, they look nice. I just picked up a little bit of my paint from the corner there because I wanted to have a tiny highlight at the very inner corner of the eye. So I started with a wash. Now what I'm doing with a Payne's Gray wash, I should say. Now I'm going in with a very saturated Payne's Gray, and I'm adding in the dark parts of the eye. I left the highlight to be pure white, so no Payne's Gray will go into there. And then there's a secondary highlight in the beginning of the eye. It's a little bit more of a longer shape, but I don't mind if that has a little bit of a bleed to it. So I'm just jumping right in there. And then you see there's a tiny dot at the front of the eye. That's that highlight that I pulled out with the paper towel there. Now for the beak, now the beak is the same rose color as the feet, so I'm just pulling in that same rose color. I'm leaving a little bit of a highlight. You can see it very clearly right now, I kind of drew an oval on the beak. So the oval is the highlight. That's the part that wasn't touched. That's the highlight. And the highlight is the bridge of the top of the beak, where the beak kind of meets the top and the bottom meet. That top part hangs out over top of the bottom. So we get a little bit of a highlight at the top, and then we get a little bit of a shadow at the bottom. And then the beak itself is on the dark side. So now I'm pulling in that shadow color from the foot. So that really dirty rose where you saw me mix the blue and the foot color together. And I'm pulling that into the lighter rose color, and I'm using a brush to soften everything. Now I'm going underneath. So now you can really see that highlight, right? You can really see the highlight on the top of the beak now because I've added in the shadow for contrast. And again, I'm just kind of pulling the paint here with a damp brush, pulling my colors together, softening it a little bit here at the bottom. The beak is getting pretty close to being done. Just have to do a little bit more softening here. There we go. Make that highlight really, really obvious. Boom, there it is, right? And then we're gonna add a nice dark Payne's gray just to the very top of the beak and a little bit to the bottom, and that's gonna help that look even more almost three-dimensional, I guess. Or really, that contrast really helps it take its shape. There we go, look at that. Get that nice crisp line in there. Because the white part has never been touched, it's not wet, so therefore there's going to be no bleed, and that gives us a really hard edge, and that's what we want there. A little soft on the bottom, a little hard on the top, hard edge. And now we're just pulling in a little bit of that darker kind of orangey color mixed in with some brown and some of that red to the areas around the beak, because it's just a little bit darker around the beak. Also around the eye, we have a little bit of darkness there as well. I'm going to stipple that in, dot, 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 as we go here. Kind of, there we go, I'm dotting it in there. Stippling is a good way to get texture in a soft area like this, so I'm just kind of doing a little bit of that. And then down here we have longer feathers, so I'll be doing kind of longer brush strokes. I'm going to soften that up a little bit there. So we are getting pretty close to being finished here. We just have a little bit more detail to do on the branches, add in some more shadows to the branches, a little bit more in the wing. Again, just really diving into the shadows on the wing. This is kind of, I think it's going to be our last layer on the wing. Now we're just zooming into that wing again, the bird again. So I'm defining the shadow underneath the wing part, as I said I would be doing. Just helps that pop, right? Now, when we're doing the eye, when we're doing the reflection, we need to make sure it's exactly lined up with the top. So that's why you kind of saw me draw that invisible line from the top to the bottom. I just wanted to make sure that I was getting the eye to be as close as I could to sitting exactly where, right underneath the eye in the actual bird. Same with the beak. Now I'm doing the dark part of the head, so just kind of calling out a few of the more dominant features of the bird here before I go into doing a little bit of the looser reflection. So you see here how I'm adding a little bit of dark paint to the reflection, to those zigzag lines that I've already created. That's a little trick I like to use when I'm doing reflections to just make them stand out a bit more. Now I'm adding in a little bit more detail to this branch. I'm just zooming through this. Don't want to spend too much time on that. We've already gone over that step. This is nice. This is where we add in just those loose branches that are kind of sitting in the background. So we don't want them to be too aggressive. Really watered down paint, just kind of throwing in some little zigzaggy branches here. Adding just a little bit of shadow to them, but just in a few places, making sure to do that when the paint is still wet. That way it'll all kind of feel soft. We don't want those to feel hard and hard edges. We just want those shadows to kind of fade into the background a little bit. Again, it would have been, smart to add some of those when we did our background wash, but because my background was drying so quickly, I just thought I'll just deal with it later. That's what I did, but it worked out pretty good here. Again, just adding some shadow to that branch, adding a little section here to that front branch, largely in shadow, so I'm not too worried about detail on that. Now I'm gonna hop back into my reflection and add in those twigs. I went a bit too far with my reflection there, so I just added a little bit more to the branch on the top to make up for it. Again, you want to line those things up as best as you can, right? The reflection doesn't need to be a mirror image because the water's a bit choppy, probably a little bit of a wind blowing, but you do need everything to line up. So the weight of the top needs to be reflected in the bottom. Yeah, so that's why with the eye, we made sure the eye lined up. With the branch, I made sure the branch lined up. Same with the beak. We need the weight of everything to be balanced. Now I'm adding those long brush strokes in, again preserving a little bit of that highlight that we've established. Even though there's a wash there, it still feels like a really nice bright highlight because of the contrast that we're building up in the reflection. Adding a little bit of dark to those longer strokes, again to help with the contrast, to help tell our story. Pulling in a little bit of that dirty rose color that we used on the foot just to the branches there to give them a bit more life. Some of those buds on the branches as well. Yeah, we're getting really close to the end of the painting here. Starting to feel really nice. I mean, I could fuss with a painting forever, but I have to know when to stop. Knowing when to quit is a big part of watercolor painting. If you fuss with something too long, it ends up getting really muddy, and you can wreck your page. You can wreck the paper, and once you wreck the paper, there's not too much you can do. Okay, just working out a few of these darker spots in the reflection now. Again, just some soft detail work here, going back into the background. You're going to notice the reflections feel a lot more real when we get that branch in, when we get some more dark tones in there. Oops, I got a little bit too thick there, but I just kind of created a wash there, and I think it looks fine. My brush, the belly of the brush hit the page instead of the tip of the brush, and that'll happen sometimes. There we go. Got that reflection in there. And that's the end of our painting. I hope you guys have enjoyed the tutorial. Please subscribe and watch some more of my videos if you're interested in some more of my tutorials. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon.